Hey, hello. Here I am. Let me get my audio together. It's probably okay. And adjust my window. I see I have Bernard Becker in this stream. Let's see now. And probably scoot this downwards a little bit. It's a little touchy finding the right size for these things, but I'll see what I can do with it. So, hello. I am here for Monday live chat. I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to do 2 hours today, but possibly we can. I shall see. Got my coffee, got emergency in a Gatorade bottle, and some kind of cold or illness, which is causing me to have a sore throat and be kind of under the weather. But I've shaken it off a little bit from yesterday. And we're going to have a sort of low intensity hangout most likely. I don't think anything is likely to happen on Monday for me to answer questions about that is going to be too challenging. So this is not too much to ask. I think I may open up something so that I can go and excuse me, look up things on the internet if I need to do that. And one of the things I can do is check and make sure that my stream is hello. That's not right. Do I have a go back? Yes, I do. Don't mind me, I'm derping away hardcore today. That's how it's going to be. I have to check and see that I'm really streaming after all. I am logged in, so and it says I'm streaming. Can't really tell if I have anybody out there at this time. It's possible people can tell that I'm ill and are going, be quiet, don't say anything. And he'll get bored and go take a nap. We are protecting the Chris. Maybe not. One thing I can do is have a little look. It does claim that I'm streaming and that it's possible people can tell that I'm ill and are going, be quiet, don't say anything. And he'll get bored and we are protecting the Chris. Maybe not. There's a certain amount of delay there. Alrighty then. So we'll set this up a bit. And Bernard hears me, yay. Okay, so here I can start having a sip of my coffee, put my feet up, and start thinking about this question that you phrased. Declicking. See, the way declicking works is kind of like this. You've got information, and then you've got sort of a tick coming out of nowhere. This is the case with vinyl. The noises in vinyl, if you're doing audio from vinyl, don't relate to the waveform that you've got here. And certainly with digital, you could have anything, and it's likely to be what's called the Dirac impulse. That is just one sample that's in completely the wrong place. Remember, that's going to make a waveform that zips up past that point, because you can't actually make sense out of a sampling system with one point. One point never really means anything. Now, the trouble with dealing with declicking properly, yeah, hi Gamma. I'm doing okay. I'm sick, so I'm not necessarily going to be able to do a full 2 hours. We'll see how it goes, but it's not so bad. The trouble with dealing with declicking is you're kind of going to want to observe the waveform from both directions. You kind of want to look at the whole context of it, because if you can see the whole context of it, then you can work out what the point is supposed to be. And that's not to say that maybe they're like, if you looked at this waveform, you'd see that it doesn't have like a lot of high frequency stuff going on. So that's clearly out of place. And if you analyzed it and in any particular way, you can do this with FFT processing, which I don't really do with my plugins. Or you could do it by just analyzing the direction that the wave is going and the rate of change. Like in this case, it's going this way, and it is also curving that way. So the rate of change is kind of like going there. And then the trajectory is going there. And if you analyze those things, can I draw demonetization? Let's see. I didn't put in the arms or head or anything. Oh, I forget turning into a dog. Oh goodness, yes. And silly audio. I've been scolded for using full audio mixes on a delay demonstration. I'm like, okay. So if you're doing declicking, you're basically thinking of things in terms of what kind of information doesn't count. And you're assuming like you've got this information, this is a click, the click doesn't count. The click is a Dirac impulse, it's one dot, and because it's high frequency stuff, it stands out. But that's not to say that you couldn't have like if your waveform looks like this, it's going to be a lot harder to do declicking, because you can have a click like in the middle of here, say and that's out of place. That's a Dirac impulse that's way far away from wherever anything else is. But you have much more of a capacity to have samples in funny places. Or if you had you've got a ride cymbal going on. So your low frequency also has this. And in that case, the only thing telling you that it's a click is amplitude. You've got smaller information going on here, and then it'll go beyond the threshold. And if it goes beyond the threshold, that tells you that you want to remove that particular one. Now, there's two ways of doing it. No, I can't do that, Nanorex. The No Time for Caution. I do not know how that song goes, and I'm not a very good keyboard player. So even if I did know how that song goes, I don't think I could do it. So I mentioned the problem of latency, meaning that if you're doing FFT analysis, basically you're calculating stuff broken up into buffers. Like, you need to be able to analyze this entire chunk of information and then analyze the next chunk of information and so on. You put it into an analysis and come up with the waveform in here that you can analyze from both directions. So if you have a Dirac impulse in the middle there, then you can analyze that and go, if this sample wasn't here, what should be here? And there's a reconstruction process. Now, that's not to say that's the only way of dealing with declicking. And, you know, I could probably do a crude declick thing that wasn't very sophisticated and didn't run any latency, and it would operate on this principle. You'd be looking at the waveform, and you'd go up to this point, and then you wouldn't know what was coming further. And at that point, you would be projecting the direction that the waveform would go if there wasn't lots of crazy high frequencies. You'd define basically, kind of like in a de-esser or whatever, you would define a low frequency version. And then you would also define how much the rate of change was altering, because that'll give you a little bit more accuracy. No, I don't know the song No Time for Caution. And I don't think I can play it because it's on a live stream. So I can look it up afterwards. I promise you I'll do that. I'll write that down. Yep. I promise you I'll go and look it up and find out what it is. I very well might not be able to play it. Depends. It might be another kind of joke that there's something like it's John Cage's 433. It's like, can you play that? No, I can't. I think you can. But supposing you're going through this, and then you've got a Dirac impulse. It's the next sample coming along, and it's like way up here. It should be possible to have the audio coming in, and say you've got some kind of symbol or something going on, and we're assuming that it's Dirac impulses we're dealing with. This will work for one sample clicks, but it'll be less effective for things like vinyl. Well, maybe not. If you've got high frequencies, and then you're going along to here, but you've got a threshold beyond which you're not going to count new information coming in, it starts to behave, and this would work in both directions. Like, you'd be down here and say this is the center of your waveform. If you're doing it with a threshold like this, then plus or minus the threshold is going to be too much to count. So if you suddenly went to 0 again, that would count as not a valid sample. And doing that would mean, okay, I'm reading some of this snapshot of the click plus. I don't know what a click plus is. You're not necessarily dealing with something that's clearly defined as a click. It could be anything that's beyond the boundary of what's permitted. This, for instance, is beyond the boundary of what's permitted because it's a single sample departure that is too far from what's allowed. And that'll be the case even if you have like a big square wave. The square wave will automatically all be beyond the declicking range. So there's valid content you might have that would be forbidden using the declicker. It would have to work with only stuff that had limited high frequencies. But if you were doing this, what you could do if you got this sample is start filling in other samples until the signal came back down to where you could use it again, and then take over from there. So you'd be able to neatly omit the click and have just a lower level artifact that kind of followed stuff. In fact, you could also, since we're tracking the rate of change, you could reconstruct what would be happening if you just kept doing this curve. And that's actually advantageous. It's a fair question as to whether you'd want to keep following it down and then have the threshold following that, or the threshold following where you previously were. Thing is, if you had a vinyl click that's just a bunch of stuff way up here, and it's too loud, and it's pretty much gone very quickly after you're done, there's aspects of that that could still be declicked even if it's not just a single click, as long as all of the extraneous material is beyond your threshold. So basically what you could do is run a no latency declicker just by doing a really good job of predicting where the waveform is supposed to go if it was just low frequencies. And then you set up your threshold, and your threshold is how much high frequencies can I even have, like ever. You can't have any other stuff in the audio, like if you hit a crash cymbal or a hi-hat, forget it. You'll just declick that out of there, and in a much more unpleasant way than, well, it's a subjective judgment, of course, but in a more unpleasant way than like an acceleration limiter, because what the declicker is doing is it's literally trying to omit the information, not to shape it, but literally skip it and replace it with something else as if it never existed. That's the ideal behavior for a declicker. So it makes it a fussy kind of situation. It becomes a little bit delicate that way. And so I'll write that down because that could end up happening. Perhaps not instantly, because I gotta chill out a little bit. I might do a really chilled out ambient music stream tomorrow. There's some stuff that I'd like to do. I have made a little note for myself about my Arturia key steps that I'm playing music through on these. They're very relevant to how I'm doing stuff. If I just hang a little LED and a resistor, basically I need an LED, a resistor, a little stretch of wire, hopefully kind of rigid wire, and a 1/8" plug. And I've got all of those things. If I wire them up correctly, I can plug them into the trigger output of the key step, tell it to do, like I think it's 12 volts. It'll do a 12 volt and it'll do a 5 volt trigger. If I plug the LED into the trigger output and play music on it, I'll have a bright blinking light that lights up whenever that particular key step is playing a note. And I could also run it into the Eurorack, because that's what it's for. But since I have multiple key steps, it could perhaps be useful to, at a glance, see what's making sound. Because that's the one I have to go to and hit rest or play a different note or something like that. Just have a little more feedback there, as in what's happening. So that's kind of, I have a vague notion of wanting to do that this afternoon. And I'll see if I can't get some of that down. I also had an idea for feeding the gates back into the axolotl so that I could ramp the tempo up maybe or something like that when many notes are playing. But I have a different idea, which is now what I'd like to do is the axolotl is there, and in a missing space on the modular, that is a Nano control. And that you hear is a snowplow. We've gotten a little snow out here. And the Nano control is plugged into the axolotl. I've got that, and I've recently learned how you use the axolotl for stuff like that, which I will mention briefly in case anybody else is using them. It's perhaps not, but I advise it. You know, this $70 music circuit board thing is quite amazing. It works with this sort of node-based arrangement where you have these different boxes and there is a line going from the one box to the other box, and it's sending information of various kinds. And I have learned that when the boxes have like more lines going to various things and stuff going up from here and so on and so forth, and the boxes have a dial on them. And I didn't know this for the first couple of months I was using an axolotl. When the boxes in the interface have a dial on them, that means you can just assign a MIDI control to them. And so the Nano control, you plug it into the USB connection, which it is. I'm going to find a better place to put it, like maybe glue it onto the front of the roads right there. I've done that before. Not really glue it, but I can use some double-sided tape and it'll be fine. You can assign these knobs to the little dials, and there's lots of axolotl controls and things you can do. Like if you had a output level and you're using the analog outputs of the axolotl, and you run things to a math calculator that has one of those little dials on it and say, okay, take your output and multiply it by this. You can assign the dial, and that can become your volume control, and it's just being accessed off the Nano control or any other MIDI class compliant device, and there's a lot of them. You know, some of the MIDI class compliant devices, and the Nano control is not one of them, let you also send LED messages and turn on and off the LEDs in the system So there's a lot of, you can get a lot of flashy lights and fancy stuff going on with these. And real physical knobs that you can touch and you don't have to do with a mouse and so on. So they're very cool little test beds. They are, I've been using them pretty much entirely for MIDI, but they also have 44, I think it's 44 or 48K, 24-bit analog ins and outs. So there's a lot of possibilities. And since the, if you're using something like a Nano control with the Axolotl, since it's taking in and out MIDI messages, the bank controls also work. And by that I mean the little light in the bottom of a Nano control, and yeah, mine looks different because I have aluminum on the front of it to make it shiny. There's 4 lights that light up, and that means that the bank's knobs and faders and buttons, the buttons work too. It goes from 0 to 8, and then 9 to so on. You know, different Nano controls have either 8 or 9 sliders. The one has 9. And if you switch the light to the second bank, then you're automatically operating like different controls and such. So like what I've got planned for that with the music streaming is I have a key change. This stuff is being driven off of key steps, and the key steps are all timed from off of the Axolotl, which is supplying a tempo, which means I can change that, but I can also send a MIDI note, and I've told it to be channel 16, and key change all of the key steps at the same time. So they can all be doing their different loop, and then I can kick them all up a half step at will, or down. And that could be controllable by me pushing a button or flipping a switch. Right now I have it assigned to one of those little dials on the, like it is this one here. If I turn this dial, then or maybe it's that one there built into it, but I can change the key up about 2.5 steps by twisting the dial, but I could also tell it, you know, keep cycling through these things. Just write a little program in the Axolotl to do this. So I won't be able to monitor it by a flashing light or whatever, but keep going through, like every 4 bars, you change from bank 1, 1, 4 bars, 2, 4 bars, 3, 4 bars, 4, and so on, 5, 6, 7, and I can set one of them to a key change. Like that one goes up for 4 bars. It'll be a half step transposed up and then back down again. And because it'll do the banks, if I define literally all of the controls ever and just assign it that way, changing the scene to address different things, I could go in and set up a really long sequence of key changes. Like it'll go for a really long time and then it'll change up, and I'll know when it changes up that it's going to be doing that for another 4 bars, and then it's going to go up 7.5 steps and then down for 16 bars after that, and then back down again. So I can set up this predictable musical behavior, and I don't have to be restricted to just the controls that you see. Instead, I can have 4 times that many because of the scene thingy. So that's kind of what I have in mind. Now, I do have some question from Bo. Compressing the different halves of the audio wave. Well, I think it comes out of the idea of a bridge rectifier. and I'll explain what that is. While my throat holds out. I'm going to be drawing some electronic components here. I'm drawing diodes. And I believe I've got this arranged right. If I don't, I'll draw it again on a different piece of paper and get it right. So a bridge rectifier is a thing like this. It's these diodes arranged in a particular way. And when your signal comes in on these two places, it works in a balanced signal, or you could treat ground as one of the connections on the signal, possibly, but it's really more suited to working with a balanced signal. And that means that these are going to alternate voltages, like this could be positive, and then a little bit later this one will be negative, and this will be positive because it's balanced. It's sort of a push-pull kind of arrangement. And if this is positive, let's say that, normally if I'm working with electronics, I'll just do it. So I haven't looked up for a while to determine whether or not this direction of a diode means that positive goes through this way and comes out the end. Let's assume that it is for now. If I got it wrong, then just, don't necessarily trust everything that I say. If diodes let stuff through the direction they're pointing, if the voltage is more positive than 0, then the voltage up here that is more positive goes through here to the positive output. It's possible I have this wrong. I think maybe I've got it drawn wrong. Tell you what, why don't I do a quick look on the internet for the answer to my question? And I can quickly draw it correctly. Oh, no, I have it drawn wrong. Here's the deal. This is supposed to match the shape of that, and this. See, both of these guys are supposed to be pointing in like the same direction. So if this one is positive, then positive voltage can go through here to this output. And then if it's the opposite way around and this one is positive and this one is negative, negative voltage can't go through this. Yep, because it is blocking the voltage coming back, but then you've got it reversed, so this one becomes positive instead, and that's able to go through to the positive. And what you get, as Bo correctly points out, is a shape like this out of the waveform that originally went like this. So it's kind of not like doubling the frequency because it's just reflecting it. And the reason it doubles the frequency is because you're no longer reading it as positive negative swing. Instead, it's getting reshaped. This is what's in the old guitar pedal green ringer. Green ringer is this. That's how it does the sound that it does. I had that put into my SG copy, and it's currently sitting in one of my guitars. I had a Green Ringer reissue, and that is the one of the tricks to the Frank Zappa guitar solo sound is that he had one of those built into his guitar. So if he was doing a bunch of intense soloing, he'd flip that on. It doesn't take much voltage, or it doesn't take much battery power, put it that way. And all of a sudden, he's got a lot more overtones and notes, stuff that he plays that is closer to a sine wave. And by that, I mean if he was playing a solo, hit a high note, and it was a harmonic, or if he rolled off the treble or something like that. Particularly higher notes, it turns out. As they start losing the higher overtones, they work better with this, and so you wind up with a really clean octave up sound. I think this is also what Octavias do, the old Roger Meyer effect. Now, how I came up with compressing the different halves of the audio wave is knowing that it did that. Knowing that altering stuff differently like you can see, these are much shallower. That causes second harmonics, and people are interested in even harmonics, not just odd harmonics. Odd harmonics are when you can take the waveform and just clip it into a square wave. That's the effect of having lots of odd harmonics, but even harmonics means that it becomes asymmetrical in that way. Knowing that, and knowing that I already use bridge rectifiers and stuff, like if I'm trying to do a compressor, I'll often have a bridge rectifier type behavior. It's a little bit easier in software. In software, you just have to say this, and that's a bridge rectifier. It means absolute value, and it just plain throws away all the negatives, and everything becomes only the positive. Now, one of the things to be careful about with this, just because you are altering stuff to have more second harmonic doesn't necessarily make it a smooth effect. Like you could take the waveform here, and I'll shrink it down a little bit. You could take the negative lobe of the waveform and attenuate it until it's gone. Like nothing there. And that technically is giving you even harmonics, but it's not smooth at all. And it's not going to sound nice at all, because you're also dealing with the fact that if you're treating the different sides of the waveform differently, there's a transition place in between. This point here and this point here. And it matters how you go. Like it matters what you do as you switch positions from that to that. That's why I ended up getting Spiral. And Spiral was all about determining that when I was doing the processing, it was changing the waveform, but then it rapidly changed which direction it was bending the waveform. Kind of like this sort of thing. You'd have a little discontinuity as you crossed zero. This is just the most extreme case. I'm going to let Marwan finish. Marwan, the trouble there is that that's not purest gain anymore. Dry wet doesn't make sense to me on a gain plugin because it's just going between the endpoint that you have and whatever that is that you did. I mean, it kind of does, but I'll put it this way. Dry wet would make more sense on purest gain if it was a Eurorack module and you were feeding some kind of control voltage into it that you knew was going to be 0 to 1 or like minimum to maximum. If you knew that you were going to be working with stuff that was always, either no effect or fully engaged effect, it would make sense to have purest gain have a special dedicated thing that allowed you to go from whatever amount to whatever amount, or from no effect to whatever gain trim you're using. But I'm not finding that to be a thing in regular plugins. So dry wet feels kind of silly to me on a purest gain specifically. Hey, there's a battery chicken. Hey. I've got random friends and miscreants that will sometimes come around, so you'll occasionally be amused by trolling or joking or silliness. And just get used to it. I don't mind it. It's fine. So let me see. Back to Bo for a sec. Cool sounds like distorted guitars or microphone recordings, vocals like you said. Vocals are not necessarily neatly, I want to say bidirectional. Like vocals is a beautiful example of stuff where you've got to honor the fact that it is wildly asymmetrical. Asymmetrical, I think, is the word. Like you'll have a voice can make a waveform like this. Like you've got, say there's your 0 point. And because it's a voice, because it's doing modulation of air from you exhaling through vocal folds and then reshaping that, when you hit really intense sonority and the your overtones get really intense, it could very easily be only on one side of the waveform. Because a voice is not a signal generator. A voice is being made through a process that is inherently asymmetrical. It's exhaling through a thing, and you're, either cutting off the airflow or letting it out, and you're letting it out in a particular way that'll be associated with frequencies and shaping that. So a voice is like the ideal, like that's not necessarily the microphone doing that. That could very easily be your voice alone making this intensely asymmetrical thing. And yeah, that can be part of the magic of the sound, is working with that kind of thing. You'll also find that on like a precision bass, here, I'll do it like this. Your precision bass waveform might act kind of like this. You'd think that it would be doing a nice smooth waveform, and instead it'll be carrying on and going like, swoop, these big spikes in here. And an electric instrument might do that. And the reason is, it's an electric instrument. It's got a pickup, and when it's going down here, that's because the pull piece of your pickup is just sitting right there. So as the string vibrates, you're supposed to be getting a pretty even balance, like a Rickenbacker horseshoe magnet pickup with magnets on both sides of it could be giving you a more even balance. But with a one-sided one where the pickup is down here and the string is up here, as it swings and zooms down closer to that pole piece, you'll get a big additional energy spike, because closer to the pole piece is more efficient. So with like P-bass recordings that you'd think would be real smooth because it's like it's a bass note, maybe it's flat wound strings, why would you get a big spike out of it? If it goes really close to the pole piece, you'll get this spike and perhaps need to deal with it in some way. So let me see. Battery Chicken is interested in how a sine shaper in Massive works. It seems to be changing by the MIDI feeded to it. Well, one possibility of a sine shaper working is it might work the way that my Fracture plugin works. Like, is it a wave folder specifically? Does it say that it's a wave folder? Also, I need to take a moment to correct something. Marwin, the deal is that purest gain is just a multiply operation at long double word length. The stuff around purest gain is like the denormalization, which keeps the CPU from getting devoured, and noise shaping to the floating point bus. So if you have a dry wet in any plugin, it's already working like the purest gain algorithm, because the purest gain algorithm is a multiply. It ain't nothing but a regular old gain change like you'd have everywhere in any DAW. It's the way that it's handled. It's the word length that it's being multiplied at for more accuracy. And since that isn't all that relevant, like all of my stuff is at least using doubles. So long double is more worrying about how long that lasts, like maintaining the resolution for a longer time. But the purest gain algorithm is not actually the multiply which changes the gain. It is the noise shaping afterwards, and it is avoiding doing extra math on it that you don't have to. So all of my dry wet stuff is already kind of like that. The dry wet stuff is included in a plugin that already contains the support stuff that makes purest gain be what it is. And that's different from if I ever talk about the bit shift gain. That's kind of the same thing, but instead it is just a 6 dB. It's multiplying exactly by 0.5 or multiplying by 2 or something like that, so that the exponent changes, and the mantissa, which is how you keep track of the details of amplification, if you multiply by exactly 0.5 or 2 or 4 or 8 or so on, then that stuff doesn't get altered. Let me see. Sine shaper. If you have information coming in like a voltage, and you have a wave shaper that's like my density plugin, you can flatten it out so that the output clips. And it'll go to just flat. When you have a wave shaper, that means that your function might be doing something like this. This is what you get when you use a sine function and then you don't stop it at this point. Like you put in a special thing saying if you're going beyond this point, then don't even go any farther. If you don't tell it to do that, it'll keep wrapping around again. So by the time you get up here, it's wrapped around to 0. And if you keep going, it'll wrap around to like negative and then back again. So what you get with a big old waveform like that is This is wavefolding. You're basically running the signal through a sine wave thing that doesn't stop at a clipping point but keeps going. So if you're running something that's mellow like a sine wave, it can keep going around and around like this as it goes up to this point. Then it slows down, and then it ends up unspiraling itself as the voltage goes back down. And that generates a lot of high frequencies, but not edgy high frequencies. Instead, they're coming out of the sine wave algorithm. So they're just bringing up crazy stuff. This could easily not be harmonically related. It'll be kind of like a ring modulator, be kind of clashy and weird, and it can be really harsh sounding. But they're great fun. There's a lot of stuff out there in modular land that uses stuff like that. You find a wave folder or a wave shaper, that's pretty much what you're talking about. I think it might even be possible to do that in analog. I just don't know how. I'm hanging in there. Julian. Oh, I know it's possible to code a plugin that can chain other plugins, because one of my favorite other coders, Guillaume from Blue Cat, does that for multiple plugins. He's got Patchwork, he's got Late Replies for a delay plugin that uses stuff. I can't do that because I can't code a plugin host. It's much more complicated. I stick to the DSP stuff. I find that often when people get really good at all these other things, that's such a large area. It is such a massive undertaking to do like a DAW or something and make it compatible with all the plugins and make it compatible with all the operating systems, that they wind up spending all their energy just in doing that and are just looking up like audio cookbook things for the actual audio processing. So I've never gone along with that. I've always just ignored the really fancy stuff. Did he already release Patchwork? Yes, he did. And I'm pretty sure he already released Late Replies. Julian, go and look up Blue Cat. Blue Cat has all kinds of wonderful stuff. Guillaume went to extra effort to make sure that my plugins were being represented properly. Like the funny little things that you can do in audio units, like a logarithmic spiral or whatever. Yeah, Guillaume does that stuff really well, and so the AU support and so on is really good, and I just swear by the guy. I think he does great work. I'm going to handle Marwin's question next. Do my Clipper compressor plugins treat stereo tracks in dual mono? Not necessarily. I'll say whether they do or not. Several of them, there's a thing that you can do in especially compressor emulating. I'm not sure it needs drawing a picture of, so I'm not going to bother. If you're accurately modeling like an SSL comp or something like that, my understanding, and I may have it wrong as the specific one, but there are hardware compressors out there that are running a thing that's kind of like a, or indeed is like a bridge rectifier, in that, you know, the amount of, let's see, where's my bridge rectifier picture? Here it is. It's going to take the signal coming in, and then the amount of attenuation you've got on the compressor, it will attenuate whether it's going positive too far or negative too far. It's bi-ended, as it were. You can also have the same thing with two diodes on the output of this, have one of them for each channel, and then have another little network with another couple of diodes there, so that if either channel is beyond a certain point, well, it will track which is the loudest of the farthest extreme from either channel. And that's the secret to some of the most desirable 2-bus plugins, is that they are linked to stereo, and they are not simply averaging or mixing the result of the two, but they're taking the hottest out of either channel and applying it to both. And that is a relevant thing. So generally, if, with a compressor plugin, if I'm implementing that, I'll say so. And I'll explain it as a special stereo way of doing it. If I put out a plugin that is a compressor and it's got the audio unit version has mono and stereo versions, what that means is that the audio unit will automatically create a stereo from the mono. And if it does, it's creating a dual mono style stereo where they're not linked. And fairly often I have ended up, because the thing is, if I take a linked stereo VST and somebody uses it on essentially a mono track, it'll be fine. It'll just process both of the sides and use one of them, and it'll be a problem that way. But with the audio units, if you've got the stereo, then it will make a non-linked version. So I might need to make a stereo linked version. And that means that the audio unit can have both of the behaviors. You can use it in stereo linked, or you can use the mono, and so on. I did emulate an LA2A compressor once. I called it Elation. It wasn't that good of a mimicry, and it wasn't that good of a compressor, but I might still... That's one of the things that's going to be coming back out again. It's just not... It's not happening in the next couple of weeks, put it that way. So, let's see. Arturia no to audio restoration plugins. I never said that. I've come up with an idea for being able to do a fairly primitive declicker. If I do a declicker like this, I can do one without latency. And it doesn't have to use like FFT calculations or whatever. I could do a basic functionality of declick. And if I do that, I'll be putting it out as open source, meaning that other people can study and learn from that, and that would be good. So I'm probably going to give that a whack. It's not that hard to do, and I can incorporate the thing about keeping the trajectory and keeping the rate of change, averaging those things a little bit. And I've already got the code for doing that because stuff like Aura, I think, is doing that. It's just not doing that in a very low frequency level. And Surge and Surge Tide do the thing of keeping track of the rate of change. So it's very doable. It's not going to be the same thing as a full-on... it's not going to be the same thing as your full-on Cedar or whatever, because Cedar is a known source for getting really high-quality declick, decrackle, so on and so forth. And they do very heavy processing to do what they do. My stuff wants to be low latency and not that heavily analyzed, so it's going to be a different breed of cat, as it were. Julian has a question. I never got an answer to it. I'll try to answer it. Why do my samples sound different when I change the phase? Well, because they are different when you change the phase. I'll show you why. Phases like this. If you're in mono, it doesn't matter whether you're in mono or stereo. Like, if this is a voice, the positive side of the voice goes over to the positive thing, and the voice doesn't really, it's very asymmetrical. So, if you flip phase, now the spike is going down. And since our hearing is also sensitive to phase, that will sound different because you have changed the wave. You know, sine waves should not sound different when you change the phase. If sine waves are sounding different when you change the phase, there's something wrong with the sine. But a lot of other stuff, especially samples and things, they should sound different. You're not changing the frequency, you're not changing the frequency content, but anything, the asymmetrical side of it, It's flipped. It's reversed. You know, people are known to flip the phase and stuff just with regard to trying to get a better sound. And that's relevant. It's legit. So Stacy's asking would I model the LA2A photoresistors? And the answer to that is I've studied the photoresistors a little bit, but I haven't fully done I've got all the CDSLs that you could want, because I am also a electronic tinkerer. So there's a bunch of stuff that I'm looking to build and do when I can get that rolling. Photoresistors have interesting behavior. Like if you squish them down with applying lots of light, they don't recover instantly. Sometimes if you squish them to a certain level very briefly, I think the way they work is they'll bounce back briefly, but if you hold them at a level, they'll kind of stay that way for a while. And there are times, like pressure itself is kind of like my way of modeling some things like that. I just usually don't do lots and lots and lots of math to try to mimic the behavior of some kind of device. Instead, what I'll do is I'll go, oh, so if you briefly compress to a certain amount, then it bounces back fast. But if you hold it at that amount for a while, then it bounces back slow. Sounds like I need to keep track of a this is how fast it bounces back variable. And then I'll do it kind of like that. And I'll go into the behavior rather than going into the specific way that the hardware device will do, because I'm always very suspicious of running the audio through a million billion calculations. I find that it kind of degrades things. So as far as doing an LA2A, the whole thing of the LA2A is about being photoresistors, and it'd be worth digging into that again and investigating how the photoresistors do their thing. And again, I've done that in the past. It's just that I didn't necessarily treat it as an opportunity to exactly mimic the behavior of CDSL that I had. CDS meaning, I think, cadmium sulfide. And that's a photocell. I am being asked about Gullfoss. Well, I'll tell you what, I have a Google page open right now, so what I'll do is look for exactly that. Yep, Gullfoss waterfall. It's a waterfall in Iceland. Cool. That's probably not what you meant. No, I've never been to Iceland, so I haven't checked out the waterfall. I know that's not what you really meant. How about I search for Gullfoss plugin? There we go. Yes, it's VST. It's an EQ, in fact. Oh, uh-oh. I see a... yeah, well, the reason CDSLs will behave differently to each other is because it's a weird little chemical process, and they're all going to be distinctly different. So, let me have a look here at some of this Gullfoss talk, and I'll tell you what I think of it. Reveal your sound. And there's a finger on a fader not included. And buy or try now. And it says it's an automatic equalizer. It uses... okay, so it uses code. Unique computational auditory perception technology. That's code. They're using code to identify and resolve problems in the frequency band. So it's making decisions around stuff in the spectral content of the audio. So problems is a very subjective term. Like, even without getting very far into this, I can begin to bring up some aspects about this. So you got a dynamically changing equalizer. It's capable of changing its frequency response a lot. And it's presumably more than 100 times per second means that it's going at least the rate of the buffer being calculated. Claims about not introducing audible artifact or degrading signal quality is kind of disingenuous, because if you really want to not introduce audible artifacts or degrade the signal quality, you use purist gain or bit shift gain. And they're not talking about this, so anything that they do could be considered an artifact or degrading. That's what making decisions about processing is. Dum-de-dum-de-dum. So some of this seems to be talking about making mixing decisions be sort of genericized. They'll say things like, this transmix, and I'm reading their webpage, the noise filter sweep is fairly aggressive. Well, that's not a problem. I know transmixes, and I built Zox boxes. The filter sweep is supposed to be aggressive. In something like a transmix, you don't necessarily, here's the deal. I think it is a perfectly legitimate thing to choose to do, but it's not at all necessarily a thing that you would choose to do. Let's say this is a frequency spectrum. Like 0, Nyquist, and you've got your trans sweep, so you've got like a you got your audio coming. This is now a frequency spectrum. It's not a waveform. So this is like 100 hertz or so. There's a kick going on, and you've got one of those aggressive noise filter sweeps going on. What that means is that there's a resonance in there. It's, for instance, a like an analog circuit. My hi-hat setup on this modular system is running into a analog filter that's capable of feeding back. Like, you can turn the resonance on this thing up until it squeals. And I do that on a fairly regular basis. And you could also have it filtering a thing and turn the resonance. This is what it looks like when you've got a resonant feedback. When you're doing that, this is the desire, this is what you're trying to make happen. And then this might be a harmonic. Maybe this is the third harmonic. Maybe your squeal is hitting a distortion. Again, you might want that. And this is your high frequency stuff. This is the kind of waveform that requires like headroom. And because if you're clipping it and your headroom is not satisfactory to be doing this very resonant peak, you'll just get more overtones, and possibly if you're doing it in the digital domain, you'll be getting that reflection quality where, you got your series of overtones, and then as they go past the Nyquist frequency, they are continuing to happen, but they're reflecting off of Nyquist, and the stuff that's coming in down here is just ugly artifacts. It's no good. When we're talking about this Gullfoss thing, and they're saying, okay, the strings lack this, this lacks that, this is too aggressive. Mostly what they're saying is we can identify a loud resonant peak. Because we can identify a loud resonant peak, we could sort of dynamically turn that down as we go. Because what we want is, and I'll tell you where this is useful and where it's not. We presumably want something that's a lot more like this. It's even. It doesn't have this loud resonant peak in these places where, they'll say the synth stabs in the build-up are a bit dull. That's because they're down here. They should be louder. The bass drum is a touch boomy. It's up here. It should be quieter. It should all be more evened out frequency-wise. And it's not necessarily even comparing the audio to a noise profile, just keeping track of what's being more dynamic and what's being less. Again, everything they say about the transmix thing underscores that concept. Noise for filter sweep, that's going to be a big peak. They say it's aggressive. I like that. The vocal oohs are a bit too resonant. And I'm like, according to who? According to you. Same thing. If the vocal oohs are too resonant, that means that they're peaking out in a narrow spike like that. That's what too resonant means. Trans piano is not brilliant enough. That means that somebody didn't put enough highs on it, and it's sitting around down here, and they're comparing it to these resonant things. You know. So what they're doing is saying, oh, it makes the strings come alive. Yeah, they turned up this, and adds this. That's because they've turned down these relative to that. Now, there are places where that's useful, and there are places where it's not. I don't think that's useful for things like a transmix, because I'm in love with your sort of analog equalizer synth filter stuff. I gravitate way too much to just like, okay, what do I want in my synthesizer? Okay, let's turn up the resonance all the way and then go from there. Filter sweep, yay! And I'm so fond of those things that I don't appreciate that response of like, okay, you got to get rid of that resonance. That's wrong. Let's dynamically turn it back down again. I'm like, no. I turned it up on purpose. I want it to be that way. If I have a low frequency thump, it's like I've gone to great lengths sometimes to have, say, a kick drum, and it'll swoop down here, and by the time that it hits like 50 hertz or so, it's really loud and it's not producing a lot of overtones. So it'll go toom, 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 and then the amplitude will swing up really far. Take a moment, Syed. Air Windows Very Mu is kind of like an emulation of Manly. It's also kind of like an emulation of a Fairchild. With my stuff, it's typically not trying to model the fine details of a hardware device, but I will typically listen to stuff that's like that hardware device and figure out whether I need to add some other kind of behavior in there somewhere. So you could say the Air Windows Very Mu is like a emulation of a device like that, but not to be tied to any specific one, nor do I want it to be tied to any specific one. It's the general concept of that. So yeah, before I leave the whole concept of this sound theory Dolphos thing, I've noticed a couple of things about audio when I listened to like evergreen records and tried to analyze them. What you want is the resonant peaks in voices, in instruments. You get sonority that way. What this Dolphos stuff does is basically strip away the sonority and make it be less, which I do not appreciate because I've always enjoyed that in audio. Sonority goes away when you go to like bad digital. You start processing it a lot and you start to lose the ability to have this just penetrating notes. Like consider a French horn in a acoustic space, part of an orchestra or whatever. Whereas anything to that effect, like, you know, thus spake Zarathustra, when you get a trumpet and you put it way the heck back in the room, and it's da, da, da. And it's this wonderful sonorous, like it just goes right through you, and you lose that in digital very easily. And you will lose that if you use this Dolphos thing, because it intentionally turns down sonority. It intentionally turns down sonority and resonant peaks. And sometimes you want resonant peaks. However, what I found is that when you're analyzing like hit records and stuff, percussive sounds follow this rule. Generally, if you've got hit record stuff, you'll find that the stuff that's most successful with people is the stuff where it very closely retains a flat frequency response all the way through, up, including the bass, everything. Maybe in different areas, like your kick might be here, and your kick might be here, and your snare might be here. It'll have a little knob on it for beefiness. And drums like this treatment a lot. You can also get this basic rough kind of treatment out of going low bit. Because if you go low bit, what happens is this. Like you've got a drum sound, and the drum sound's got a frequency response like this. There's a thump here around 200 hertz or something, and then there's these various spikes and so on. You go low bit, and all of a sudden, if you, especially with the sampling rate, but also with the quantization, because quantization is non-correlated information, you got a bunch of other hash that is very evenly distributed. And I mean very evenly distributed. If you've got truncation hash or sample rate crunching hash, it's literally bringing in frequencies even lower than the low frequency thump. This is what truncation does, is it throws all this garbage in, but it's very broadly dispersed garbage. And if you're doing that with a drum sound, your drum sound is going to be more evenly distributed, because the truncation garbage that is being put in, it's like a sympathetic resonance on a snare or something like that. You've got this rattle that's going along with everything. And people hear that more even distribution of sound as part of their rhythmic sound and go, oh, yeah, that sounds about right. It's a beat. It's hitting across the entire band. It's a beat. It's a thump. So this whole thing about the, what do they call it? Gulfas. This whole Gulfas business of like, we can take your resonances and make them go away. That's a subjective call, but I'm happy to say that there is a use case where that is all kinds of useful and relevant. It's not the only way that you can do it, but I would throw this kind of thing on a drum bus. I would throw this kind of thing on a percussive thing where you want it to hit more evenly. You don't want funny resonances poking out because it's the impact and the general behavior. Like if you're doing low frequency thumps or some kind of information going on, and you need to go to big bass bins and make a broadly useful low frequency kick, what people will typically do is they'll layer all different kinds of kicks together, and that also has a similar effect. And they're shooting for something that just hits as a solid block and doesn't have like a stray 100 hertz resonance that's poking out and going honk. You know, you don't want that. So there are super relevant places for this Gulfas thing to exist. I just don't feel that it's like, you know, keep it away from my psytrance, okay? I want my psytrance to be super resonant. That's kind of the whole point. So I'm not going to enjoy having stuff be flattened out by something like this. The dynamic EQ that's taking away the very things that I like most about the audio. You know, that's not always going to be good. But then throw it on your drum bus, and that should be very relevant. Yeah, CMO Pro, Fairlight programmer, 8-bit, yep, exactly. And I've just showed you why. Your initial samples would be a waveform like this with empty spaces, and then as you 8-bitify it and crunch it up and like sample rate crush it maybe, all of the extra stuff that's being introduced, all the garbage that's being introduced is completely broadband. Completely broadband and very evenly distributed. So this is also why in hip-hop and rap, low-bit beats have always been so effective. It's actually a super effective way of getting around the tendency for organic, natural, high-fidelity recordings to be kind of peaky. You know, there are places where you want peaky and there are places where you don't. And the rhythmic stuff, you know, you could have it be peaky, but you're kind of missing out. And it's the opposite to some of the melodic stuff. I honestly think that melodic stuff and harmonic stuff is way better the more peaky it is, but rhythmic is the opposite. Yeah. Julian, I've got a number of different things for reducing the bits on drums, and then DAWs themselves often have stuff like that. I'm trying to remember the name. I've got D-Res, I've got BitGlitter. They're part of my new updates download. So that is something that you can try. And I heartily... Corrosive Abuser has the original audio unit version of Elation, which has not come out as VST yet. Well, then I'll be sure to bring it out for in my copious free time, in between all the other stuff I'm bringing out. I'm still looking at some of this Gilfa stuff. You know, never mistake. Never mistake bringing out clarity using some kind of processing thing as automatically different from just turned it up a little bit, or you turned the treble up a little bit. With a lot of this, and interestingly, the sound on sound, because I'm looking at the sound on sound review, what they say is percussion sounds really benefit. Well, that's kind of what I just said for 10 minutes, is the percussion sounds is where this would be really useful. And, you know, if you want a natural sounding sheen of clarity, see, I don't want a sheen of clarity, I want clarity. There's a difference. If I'm listening to audio that's like some dub techno or whatever, I'm really into dub techno, as a matter of fact, and I've got this reverby thing going on here, and then something that's like 100 feet away or more, and then I've got a bass, and the bass needs to not interfere with other stuff, and then the hats or whatever, different things are happening in the sound. The stuff needs to get out of each other's way in the natural way by having things be resonant and kind of non-interfering. It needs to not throw additional fuzz, or, you know, I'm trying to maximize whatever resonant peaks are needing to be there. And, you know, a sheen of clarity means here's some additional fuzz that doesn't even belong in the sound that we're putting there because you can more clearly track some of the instruments if they have high frequency resonances or overtones. Like if you take a bass and your bass is like here, and then you're adding a you throw a third harmonic onto the bass. That means you can hear the bass more clearly, but it's no longer the same sound. Like you can have a high frequency sheen in which you're keeping track of all of this, and then the bass that you had is still throwing in harmonics as high up as this. And that will be more clarity on the bass, but it's no longer the same bass. It's a completely different notion of sound. So adding a generalized sheen of clarity is not necessarily what you want. Okay, so that's fine. That's it. That's me on Golfos. Buttercomp 2. Should you use Buttercomp 2 for all-round purpose like mix, bus, submix, individual channels? Well, the thing about Buttercomp is that it is very, very gentle. So you don't necessarily always want it for every conceivable purpose. Instead of thinking of things in terms of a mix bus versus additional channels or whatever, think of things in terms of how do I want the dynamics of this to change. Like some of that stuff, like Buttercomp is the closest thing you're going to get to like Surge or Surge Tide, where they will just refuse to react to dynamics unless it's just so gentle that you barely notice it. like if you're doing kind of like automatic gain control and you just want to average out the levels of everything without really being able to notice it too much, part of the reason it's called buttercomp is it's like, okay, it's the smoothest, silkiest thing, and it's not going to interfere with the sound. This is a far cry from like doing a Phil Collins vocal in the 80s, where he's running into that Allen and Heath compressor and blowing it away. I have entirely separate compressors for those purposes. So you should use buttercomp to, in any position where you need it to be very smooth and laid back, which means it'll be allowing some dynamic spikes to come through. It's not a limiter, far from it. It's about as far, it's almost as far from a limiter as you can get. The farthest thing from a limiter is like surge tide or surge. The distinction between a couple of my compressor plugins is like this. Buttercomp is extremely slow. Pop is extremely fast and aggressive. So any of these things you could use in any position. It's a matter of what they're doing and why you're doing it. I know people who are using Pop and Buttercomp at the same time on the 2-bus. And that's because they are using Pop with mostly dry from the dry wet to bring out a certain spikiness in the dynamics. And then they're using Buttercomp to mellow out a general sense of dynamic swing. And you can have both because they're doing completely different things. They're occupying totally separate purposes. And then another one that people either love or don't is PyWhackit. And the thing about PyWhackit is it's doing an entirely different thing. With PyWhackit, you've got, say, a dynamic spike, and then the quiet part down here, and it's a compressor. But what it's doing is instead of just compressing everything and turning it down when you hit the amplitude and it causes itself to turn down, it's applying the leaning out behavior from density. And when you take density and you turn it to a negative amount, it makes this weird lean spiky sound that's the opposite of positive density. It's not literally the opposite, because the opposite of positive density is, purest console encode and decode. But it's a different reaction. It's a cosine calculation. And for that reason, if you hit PyWhackit with loud transient type things, what it'll do is it'll step on sort of the body of the sound. Like the fullness of the sound will get dialed back a notch. Not in a wildly obvious way, but just it'll sit things back and place them in a sort of solid position that doesn't shift around dynamically. But because it's doing that calculation, that density thing, the attack transients are never altered. Like, it's doing this thing where it'll change this waveform into a much leaner waveform, but the loud parts are still going to be kind of left there. So when you're using PyWhackit, what you're getting is a seemingly compressed sound where quiet sounds will be moderated and kept into a kind of boxed in. But your louder overtones are going to continue to poke out. And because they're not being altered, there's less change between the compressed and uncompressed versions. So the louder overtones will remain more accurate than with any other compressor. Because with other compressors, the louder overtones are exactly where it starts turning it down, so they change a lot. With limiters, the louder overtones change completely. limiters and clippers, the louder overtones are just plain gone. But Pyewacket, it makes a point of keeping the louder overtones, like the initial attack transient, is essentially unaltered. And it's the opposite of, what's its name? Let me go and find it. Gullfoss. Yeah, see, Pyewacket is the opposite of Gullfoss. The more you know. Now, on to some of the other questions. Well, we've got probably another half an hour, and then I'm going to go and lie down. I have a Flutter plugin. The thing about the Flutter plugin is it exists in audio unit form, and I never went very far with it because I had trouble getting it to behave properly latency-wise. I have a Flutter plugin that does a very good job of fluttering, but it always, there was a unpredictable amount of delay involved. So you can do that, but it'll make things be a little bit less responsive. Also, bear in mind that I've got Flutter I've had Flutter in some of the tape modelers like 2Tape. I think 2Tape might still have Flutter in it. It's been a while since I worked on it. But yeah. Flutter can happen. It's just that the way that I implement Flutter, I can't keep it literally the same latency all the time. In fact, if I do it, it's always going to be running a certain amount of latency because it's going to be wavering between delay extremities. And for that reason, it's less of a generally useful plugin for me. It's harder to fit into things. And I don't often get really enthusiastic about putting out, well, that's not really true. I kind of get enthusiastic about putting out plugins that are super inconvenient and don't work. But it also requires lots of explanation. And what stopped me from releasing, see you later, Bo. What stopped me from releasing Flutter as a 4Pay plugin back in the day when I was doing Kagi shareware and selling them was that I couldn't fix the problem with latency. They just always had lots of latency. So let me see, what else have we got here? I think that was kind of the last question, unless other people have other things to say. It says, go ahead and throw whatever further questions or anything that you don't feel that I addressed in enough depth, and I will keep on with it. Still got a little more emergency. That is a sort of powdered drink mix that is mostly vitamin C. I use that a lot. I could also scroll back. Probably, I think I've been keeping up fairly well, though. Yeah, I might try to scroll back a little bit. Yeah, we're talking about Gullfoss, and then somebody else has a thing called Soothe, and they're basically the same idea. And again, they are the opposite of Pyewacket. Pyewacket will let you have your high energy, peak energy. That's an interesting question. Will plugins replace hardware in the... Oh my God, we have all of the big debate subjects coming up. Okay, I'm definitely going to be here until 1. Then I will go and rest. There is a extent to which plugins and virtual things in general are tending to replace hardware, and there are some reasons for that. I'm kind of an old dude at 50, and I've been doing Air Windows for a bunch of years, and I've been working to sort of build my world and stabilize it for a bunch of years. So I do my level best with that, and because I live in a little house up in Vermont and stuff, I can have things like a computer, or I can have things like a drum kit in a room, I can have things like the modular synthesizer and stuff, but there have been times when I had to move around from place to place rather a lot because I didn't have any kind of stable living situation. I mean, there was a time a bunch of years ago when I was actually homeless. It's over 20 years ago now, but I lived through that because I didn't have my stuff together. And at that time, I wouldn't be able to have physical stuff. Like, I have had to throw my possessions in a dumpster and throw them away because I was getting evicted from my apartment, becoming homeless, didn't know anybody who could, and when you're living that way and you end up being evicted and whatever, a bunch of the stuff that you'd end up throwing out is garbage anyway. So it's like I've had somebody who didn't have house stability, and they left a bunch of stuff in a room in my place. And as it happens, the stuff that he brought over to my place so that he didn't have to throw it away was basically garbage. Like, a piece of wood with Formica on one side of it and a busted old chair. And when our worlds are that embattled and challenged, we cling to stuff like that. That's also what makes people become hoarders, is being that threatened and having that little, that you cling to any little thing that you can possibly have. Now, that relates to the question about whether plugins replace hardware like this. There's a lot of people who are that embattled. There's a lot of people who are that insecure and have that little safety that they don't necessarily have the ability to have things like books or guitars. But you can have a guitar or a synthesizer or something like that on your computer, or you can have one in the cloud. Even if you lost your computer, if you got it back somehow, then if you've got it stored somewhere on the internet, if that information is there, then you can have it again. And also plugins, because they're digital technology, can be reproduced and duplicated. Like, it doesn't cost me anything to put out new updates.zip and give everybody fresh copies of literally everything that I've got. In fact, I encourage people to torrent it in case, like my servers die or something like that. I want that still to be out there. So, at the same time, when I'm doing music, as in I'm going to be live streaming again tomorrow, I'm using analog stuff. I'm using hardware. It's not all analog hardware. I've got a MIDI verb sitting over here, and that's a really old school reverb, so it's a digital device, but it's an analog input and output on it. And you can build hardware in the same way that I build plugins. Like, if you can get transistors, if you can get capacitors and things like that, and you can, then you can solder together hardware. It's not like some special thing where you can only do that if you're this very fancy person and you're working with a design lab and stuff like that. Stomp boxes in particular, guitar stomp boxes, are very easy to throw together. But more and more, like now, you could build stomp boxes, but you can take this thing that I'm pointing at, the Axolotl. That is a little experimenter board with analog inputs and outputs, and it can be the brain for a whole music generating system. Like, you can take voltages into it, you can put voltages out of it, you can take the input and output that it's got and run it into, like, say an analog overdrive. You don't have to do the overdrive in software. It's a physical device. So you could build like a tube and a tube power supply and run it into that, and then you'll get a different sound out of it. So there's not going to be replacing hardware, because hardware can do relevant things. And if you got the space for it, and you can get the parts, and the parts are very, very cheap. Like, I'm looking right now behind you at a area on my wall where I have all this electronic parts stuck up. And then there's tube after tube of chips, IC chips, 4049 hex inverters, logic chips, a bunch of different kinds of op amps that do different things. Each of these individual chips, and they all have the little legs. They're not surface mount technology, not yet. Eventually, you won't be able to get the ones with the legs, but they are like 55 cents each, these things. The chips are not necessarily expensive. So working with hardware is not so inaccessible. You just kind of have to learn a whole new side of things, but the rewards can be great. It's really possible to do amazing sounding stuff in hardware if you know what to do. And that's something that will doubtless come up in other talks as I continue doing the live streaming thing. So I've got a couple of other comments while I'm at it. I will touch on the 440 by 435 hertz to say it's probably it'll cause a change. I don't know if it resonates with the vibrations of the spheres or something, but as you get more sharp, things are going to become a little more intense, and if you get flatter and sort of slacken the tuning off, it'll probably be more soothing and relaxing. And I'm not sure it's any great grand thing other than, a little sharper is going to be a little bit more energetic and a little bit more tightly wound, and vice versa. That's pretty much all I think about 440 tuning versus the 435, or I think 432, is it? Whatever it is. Bernard is asking, can I use the drum sample and loop only a short piece of it? That's actually good advice. I should remember to do that more often. I've sometimes done that, and then sometimes I don't. One of the awkwardness is that these recordings that I've got are kind of hacky, and they don't necessarily loop super easily. So, I could try looping only a short piece of it. I know that some people find little short repetitive loops to be super annoying, but then sound engineers often like them for that exact reason, that you can hear it cycling away like mad, and then whatever you're doing to change it is more easily perceived against the continually repeating side of things. So, yeah, I'll try to remember that. And Syed Durifal Hulk would, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, wants to know if Purist Drive makes PD console sounding more like a hardware console. And depends on how you mean. Like, many hardware consoles are going to roll off highs a little bit, and it'll make things sound a little bit more like that. The way that it does it is not exactly like any particular analog behavior. Like the Purist Drive and Purist console, the Purist Drive console sound, what's being done there has more to do with different samples coming after each other rather than modeling a specific behavior that's on a console. Instead, it's just going like, you can do this and you can do this, and here's how these things interact with each other. So, in a sense, it's going to be more like a hardware console in that it is more of a departure from just straight up perfect sound forever, pure mathematical, etc. It's rolling stuff off and distorting and affecting things. So that tends to be more like a hardware console, but Purist Drive is not a specific modeling of anything that you're going to find in actual analog. It's a behavior that's available in digital that works kind of like that. It's an algorithm rather than a complicated modeling of something that happens in the real world. And the algorithm happens to have a good sound to it that brings some positive qualities. So it's just isolated. Like, instead of thinking of all different kinds of stuff to do to be more close to in a hardware console, it's like, well, we can do this with extreme purity and clearness, and if we do as little as possible, we're not messing up the sound in any other way. So here, have this purist drive, have this slight shaping of the highs and the organic nature of the sound and so on, because we can do this alteration, and we can do the alteration at a very high level of resolution. We can retain a lot in the sound while still changing it a little bit, rather than trying to change it in a bunch of different ways at once and then having that degrade the sound because you're doing too much. I hope that was a decent answer, because it's a relevant question. It's like, oh, are you modeling a console? Are you modeling a particular hardware gear? And usually I'm not. Usually I'm just finding a behavior that seems to be helpful. All right. So we're at 12:46. I'm willing to throw another 15 minutes at this, and my voice is actually holding out surprisingly well. I mean, it hurts, but it's holding out surprisingly well, and I can rest it all the rest of the day, so that's fine. So basically, I'm wondering if anybody has further questions. Yes, I do. Oh, I can tell you what book I used, and I don't think I have it anymore. No, I don't. I can't remember. I can't place it. But I can even enter it into the chat, I think. I bet it's been reprinted. Craig Anderton's Electronic Projects for Musicians, by which he basically means guitar players, because it's about making stomp boxes. But that is where I got started with that stuff. It's well explained, and you get a sense of how these things go together. It's not the ultimate answer to every question that you would have, but it's a really good jumping in place, and it gives you stuff that you can do. I started building the tube sound fuzz, and I have never been without 4049 hex inverter chips ever since. And you know, you can use I think there's actually a different one, but you can use these hex inverter chips for other things. There is a synthesizer filter that's made out of the 4049 or 4050, something like that, 4069. And I think it was the WASP filter. Like, there is a synthesizer that was called the WASP, and it was a strange little synthesizer, and it had a very unusual sounding filter because the filter was made from one of these chips. And it was stressing the chip out so much that the WASP has a reliability problem of the filter of the chip sometimes burning out. Now, every time anybody talks about that, usually the question they ask is, why didn't you put a heatsink on the chip? If you know it's burning out, there's a very simple, obvious thing that you can do about that. But I guess nobody has thought of putting a heatsink on the chip for the WASP. But that is the kind of chip that it used, and it's the same kind of chip that is in the tube sound fuzz. I have made, here, it's just worth a final sketch if I've got room on any of this pieces of paper, or come up with a new piece of paper. I have made a 5-band EQ, or I think 6-band EQ, out of the 4049 hex inverter chip, because it works kind of like this. Here's 3 of the hex inverters. You start here, you go in here, and it makes it louder. And it makes it inverse because it's an inverter. It's like a single FET or transistor or something like that, where you're going into the negative input and then the output is flipped. If you put, say, here's your negative input. The hex inverter, it only has the input, so you've only got that. I believe that you draw the little dot on it to say that it is inverting, although I could be wrong about that. So don't take that for granted. If you have these, they might not necessarily work as audio. It might be trying to go to some positive or negative voltage because it's a logic element. So what you do is you put a resistor on, and if the resistor is a small resistor, or virtually nothing, then you have essentially unity gain. If the resistor is a large resistor, like 10 megohms, then you have extremely high gain, but it's still bringing back the negative. It's bringing back a little of the negative, the output to the negative input, meaning that it's pulling the voltage to zero, pulling the voltage to sort of the middle, because anything that's coming out is going back in the other way. Now, if you also add a capacitor, those are now high frequency removers, because the high frequencies go through the capacitor and right to the negative input, which means the high frequencies get turned down. And since you can usually not run into these things without some kind of isolation, you've got high capacitors on here as well. And if you've got different sizes of capacitor, they're going for different frequencies. This is becoming a 3-band EQ picture. And if, let me see now. If this input thing, because if you had the two capacitors and they were the same, it would be kind of like, there's actually a Devi-Ever circuit that does this, but it'd be using the inverter to try to be unity gain. Instead, if the one coming in is much bigger than the one that's feeding back, you get a frequency band. It can only be low frequency enough to fit through this, but anything higher frequency than this goes back into the negative input and stops again. So, therefore, this is going to get a frequency band of like up here. And then this one, since it is taking in the stuff that's lower but is not, like, see, this is a roll-off, and it'll only let through stuff from here, but this one is suppressing exactly that frequency because it's coming back through that capacitor. So that one rejects this area and takes only lower stuff down to this point, and this one takes only lower stuff from that point down to lower. You now have a 3-band EQ. Each of these stages is putting out a different frequency band because the capacitors are letting through or not letting through various things. And when you combine them, say with a knobs, I'll draw circles to represent the knobs. You mix them together, and this is a working 3-band equalizer in hardware based on a 4049 hex inverter chip. Or you could also use like op amps and stuff. I have less experience fooling around with transistors, but I hope to begin doing that too, and I can talk about my experiences with it, because so many people have done really cool stuff with transistors. I mean, maybe not as nifty as, you know, tubes and such as far as properly old school things, but all the same, some of the old transistor circuits are amazing, especially with guitars. You've got there's this enormous sort of wide spectrum sparkle and glitter and energy and attitude that comes through using some of these primitive transistor circuits into, say, a tube amp. And what I find is that it's all about, so I just drew this with the Sharpie, and you imagine that that is a wire, and you're doing sort of point-to-point wiring. Now, you can also do printed circuit boards, in which case you're looking at something. No, let's pretend that the printed circuit board is using printed circuit board size capacitors as well. I'll draw a resistor like that, but the wires that are leading to the resistor are printed circuit board traces. And we got another one of these PCB capacitors, like a tiny electrolytic capacitor that technically can contain the voltage, but it's microscopic. And then we got maybe our output wire, and then you go to the output jack. I find there's a difference between this and this, sound-wise. And I have seen it in multiple, like I've even bought hardware devices that were built on the microscopic scale using this kind of stuff, and found that there was a shockingly huge difference between like guitar stomp boxes that were made all old school with like turret board and big old devices and capacitors wiring to each other and stuff, or through-hole wiring and fairly large circuit boards, and the stuff that was in modern computer style, where everything is just beyond microscopic. The sound also got kind of microscopic as well. And I think that's because of the amount of energy that's capable of being transferred along these wires. So that's an area that I'm going to be working on, because there's a lot of room for development. And it all depends, too, because, like, I can point over here again. That Axolotl experimenter board, if it's doing all of its work in the realm of MIDI, it doesn't matter. It's only sending information, and it can calculate the information any way it wants. Like your home computer would not be benefited from being built out of tubes and giant old capacitors and things. But your guitar stompbacks, on the other hand, might be a pretty striking difference. Particularly if you're doing things like running, like, I don't know, I got a compressor that I was hoping to run electric bass into. Oh boy. The microscopic pieces did not go well with the bass. So yeah, I'm working on these various things. Those are the things that have captured my attention. And yeah, thanks to you as well, Dusser. If you can get a copy of that Craig Anderton book, I heartily recommend it. It's a really good introduction, always was. And if you build things, often you can just run the output of your circuit into whatever sound card it is that you want. So you probably could send your audio through an external sound card, yeah. You just work out whatever it is that you need to do, tinker with it, and try to do it. There's lots of other questions that I can answer for you, like the difference between guitar level or line level, or professional versus consumer line level, like what's -10 versus +4, and modular level, which is even higher. And these are all things that you can grapple with as you start working with it. And yes, the PD console is indeed the combination of Purist console and Purist drive. You've got that exactly right. So the thing is that it's just a way of making it sound better rather than making it sound like any particular hardware device, because it's not modeling any particular hardware device. It's just got some similar behaviors. And I like isolating the behaviors. I like having individual stuff and not getting bogged down in trying to replicate any particular piece of gear. Because there's a number of things about that, like it's difficult and awkward to try to replicate particular pieces of gear, and you'll end up doing so much that it'll, probably degrade the sound because you're doing all these calculations and they have a cost. And then the ultimate result is so you've tried to exactly model a piece of gear, and you've probably not succeeded because it's still a computer-based thing. But then you're trading on the name and the reputation of somebody else's creation. And I'm just increasingly not into that, so I'm not going to be doing that kind of stuff. All right, so it is 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so we've done another 2-hour session. Does anybody have anything they really need to talk about before I go? Because it's getting time for me to go. I will try. I'll be doing some kind of nice, chilled out music stream, and I don't have to talk for that, so my voice will get to rest. And by next week, I will have bounced back. I'm already kind of bounced back. I was feeling a little under the weather yesterday, but it's not so bad. It's just winter, it's like winter, and it gets really cold in here, which is why I'm wearing the super heavy, and I'm talking super heavy bathrobe. I'm staying warm and bundled up that way. So, on that note, I guess I will say adieu for now, and I'll catch up with you all next week. Bye-bye.